What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. So, for the past few modules, we've been kind of looking at the history of Asians in America, the discrimination, oppression, and violence that they faced as being immigrants, quote unquote, from a foreign land, right? And a lot of that discrimination and oppression centered around their labor, right? And so, to begin this section of resistance and social justice, we're going to look at labor activism, labor resistance, because that is such a large part of people of Asian descent's narrative and history within the United States. So, this lecture is a brief history around people of Asian descent and labor unions. So, the first thing I want you to know is that contemporary labor unions are a cross ethnic institution. They are teams of individuals across gender, race, ethnic, and other social identities coming together to guarantee the things you care about, like decent wages, affordable health care, job security, safe and respectful workplaces, and fair scheduling. Now, a lot of these unions have a history of racism, right? But we're talking about contemporary unions that really doesn't center race in its membership, right? Historically, both union and civil rights activists understood that labor rights is not just about work, right? It's a human right. It's about a person's liberty to choose what they want to do as work, to be able to earn enough to support themselves, their family, if they want to marry, if they want to travel, right? It's a deliberate act, right? Labor injustice is a deliberate act of coercion, right? And so seeing the connection between union rights and civil rights, right, as both human rights, really puts in perspective this concept of labor and exploitation of labor. I also want to give you this definition of civic engagement because by participating in labor unions, right, it really allows people to participate in civic engagement. And civic engagement means participation in your community with the purpose of influencing, improving, or participating in society as a politically informed and engaged citizen. You cannot fight labor injustice without being politically informed, right? And so, as you can see, again, that this concept of labor is also connected to policy and politics. And so, for people of Asian descent, right, civic engagements provides a vehicle for them to resist oppression. And so it's really important to understand how civic engagement um, and the aspects of learning how to participate to improve and influence your community is a political act of resistance. So I want to talk about the strategies that historically labor unions use to achieve better standards of living, right? And as I mentioned, civic engagement is one of those ways that we seek to better our standards of living, but also through collective action. And so I'm just going to go through a brief history of strategies and labor unions who presented these strategies and the idea behind these strategies to seek these better standards of living. So, the first strategy I want to talk about is transforming unions into political parties. Now, what does that mean? It means that as a labor union transforms into a quote unquote labor party, similar to, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, then they have more influence on improving or excuse me, influence on legislation that is favorable to workers, right? Because if they're elected, right, then they have say in some of the policies that come down the line that affects not only workers' lives, but all of our lives, right? And so in 1828, the very first Labor Party was in Philadelphia, and it was called the Mechanics Union of Trades Association. Um, they then transformed their union into a political party called the Working Men's Party, right? In an effort to pass policies, in an effort to have voice on policies that they are trying to affect and improve the lives of workers and their family members. Now, the second strategy is this concept of just one big union, regardless of, if you're a worker or if you're not a worker. Um, but in 1869, the Knights of Labor formed and created an inclusive union that was open to everyone, regardless of employment status. Even Black folks were included in this concept of one big union because they thought that if everybody belonged to one union, the membership would be so large that it could exert enough power that employers would meet their demands. So again, this is strategy number two, this concept of an inclusive union. Now, again, I want to say that even though Black folks were included in this particular Knights of Labor union, people of Asian descent were not, right? And we'll see a little bit of that later. Now, strategy three was this concept of business unions, right? Unionism. And by the way, if you don't know what unionism is, the belief in unions, right? ISM is the belief in, right? Or, yeah. So anytime you see ism on anything, it's the belief in whatever the prefix is. So in this case, union. So in 1886, the American Federation of Labor, AFL, which we all should have heard of if you have any, if you've heard of any labor, there still exists. The other two unions do not no longer exist. But AFL was founded and used this concept of business unionism, right? And basically, membership only included skilled trade workers, but excluded unskilled and semi-skilled workers. And there was a reason for this. They thought that because there was such a small percentage of skilled trade workers, they would have more power bargaining, right? Because they didn't have anybody who could come in and take over their job. So a lot of, employers, when employees strike, they bring in what they call strike breakers, right? These are workers who replace employees that are on strike, right? But in this particular aspect in business unionism, their idea was that if I'm the only person that knows how to do this, and I'm the person that's teaching everyone, then I can demand whatever it is I need and not have to worry about being replaced and therefore being undermined in my requests, right? And so, you know, because of this, they use this concept of collective bargaining, right? Which basically is a process of reaching an agreement between workers and their employers regarding wages, working conditions, trainings, and other issues within the work, right? And because it was both economic interest for both employer and employee, right? It provided incentive to negotiate and reach a settlement, right? And that's collective bargaining. And that's something that unions today do. The next and last strategy that I'm going to talk about is strategy number four, industrial unionism. This came out of 1934 Congress of Industrial Organization. And basically, they organize workers along industry lines instead of skill lines. So in the business unionism, they only included skilled trade workers and excluded unskilled and semi-skilled, right? In industrial unionism, we're looking at the actual industry, and all of those members who work within that industry is within that one union. So, for example, every employee that creates autos, for example, would be in the auto industry, right? And they would all be in one union. And so this idea was that the union gains power by having everyone organized of all skill levels, right? So if they're wanting to strike, the whole company walks out, not just the skilled laborers, right? Or not just the semi-skilled laborers, but the whole industry walks out. And when their demands are met, and they negotiate, it's not just for one company but for the entire industry. So for example, if Ford was the company that was negotiating with its employees, right? If they negotiated a higher wage, guess what? It wasn't just for Ford employees, but it would be for anyone. It would be for Chevy, for I don't know the other car companies. I mean, in this day, Kia. I don't know the other ones. Ford, Chevrolet, Cadillac. I don't know, but you get what I'm saying. So regardless of their employer, excuse me, and this strategy, everybody was organized within the industry. And so what you see contemporarily, right, is a combination of the business unionism and the industrial unionism. So, and you see this through the combination or combining the two organizations, AFL and CIO, right? And so this is the labor union that exists today. And its strategy, and if you're in a union, this might be familiar. But if you're not, I'm just saying you're at will. And so that means that an employer could just fire you for whatever reason, and you have no protections as an employee, as a worker. But the AFL CIO strategy is to organize workers into local unions. So for me as a professor, we're under the AFL, right? But we have our own local union, AFT, which is, I don't know what it is, but that's our local union. So we then organize the workers in those local unions to then negotiate with our employers to improve our standards of living, right? And we do that through collective bargaining. Again, that concept of reaching a mutual agreement for both the employer and employee. Now, when we talk about Asian workers, workers of Asian descent, and unions, right? As usual, and as we've been talking about since up to this point, is that they were excluded from not only, unions, but excluded and limited to jobs that no one else wanted. And most times those jobs didn't even have unions. So they were not only systematically excluded, but also, I guess, systematically excluded. I don't know what else that could be. um, but they were regulated to agriculture, railroads, and mines. And these were some of the most dangerous jobs that a person could have. And in fact, um, uh, when we talk about the original passing of the Social Security Act during the Great Depression, a lot of these jobs, specifically agriculture and domestic work, were excluded from receiving these benefits. And it was mostly because those jobs were regulated, right, to the most marginalized identities, right? And so that was another way to systematically exclude um, Asian workers from some of the benefits that, white workers and workers who were born in the United States and who were allowed to become citizens, right, to have. And so what you see is because of this exclusion, and what I think is, dope is, I don't know what, it's a form of resistance organizing their own independent labor organizations, right? These labor organizations that existed outside of the mainstream labor movement. So when we're talking about, the mechanics union, we're talking about the Knights of Labor, right? And them excluding Asian workers from those unions, how then do you resist? How then do you better um, your position, right, as a person of Asian descent, doing the same labor as those who are protected by these unions, right? And so creating your own labor organization, right, is a form of resistance, a form of creating your own institution to serve as a protection, a workers' protection for those of people of Asian descent. And so, when we talk about race and exploitation, right? This is the cornerstone of the reason that most people of color, but specifically within this context, excuse me, workers of Asian descent had to strike was because of their race, ethnicity, and the ability, the social allowance of them to be exploited for their labor, right? And so you see some of the early strikes within Asian American history was due to racism and exploitation. And we'll go through some, particularly in briefly go through, particularly in agriculture and and uh, railroads, even though, there's also other labor sectors that are concentrated. I'm thinking of, the laundered section. I'm thinking of the seamstress, right? And those who work in sweatshops. I'm thinking of those type of exploitative and hard labor that, again, a lot of people of Asian descent were regulated to because they were shut out of other sectors of labor. So in 1867, 2,000 Chinese railroad workers struck against the Central Pacific Railroad for higher wages and equal pay and hours. Because what they were experiencing was that even though they were doing the same labor as white workers, they were being paid less and working more, right, than those white workers. 1870, Chinese workers struck against Houston and Texas Central Railroad over the same thing, and there's a little spelling error there, and over their wages and failure of the contract to comply, or of the company to comply with their contract, right? And unfortunately, because Asian workers had no protection in place, these strikes basically was shut down, right? They lost um they lost the strike because they had no protection, no legal protection, no physical protection. And so a lot of these strikes were lost because of the brutal and violent tactics by employers, right? Hawaii, right, where a lot of plantations exist and a lot of farm workers were. You see, in 1904, 1,200 Japanese workers struck for higher wages. In 1909, 7,000 Japanese labor struck for receiving lower wages than Portuguese and Puerto Ricans, right? Again, you see, that even within the racial hierarchy, people of Asian descent were still lower than those who were European immigrants and Latin American immigrants. In 1924, 2,000 Filipinos struck for higher pay, an 8-hour day, and better housing because a lot of the times in agricultural work, you lived on the land where you worked. And so a lot of the housing was not meant for people to live in. It was falling down buildings, very little heat and what do you call those whatever. I can't I the words are escaping me, but when it's hot in the summer, it keeps the cool air, your house cool, and then vice versa in the winter, right? And so that didn't exist. So you see a lot of people, a lot of Filipinos during 1924 um excuse me, striking for a better standard of living, right? And similar to railroad workers, because of their lack of protection, right? These also failed. These were failed strikes. On the main, but what comes out of it was this inter-ethnic laborers association, right? Hawaii's labor association. In 1919, Japanese and Filipino workers combined their labor organizations to create the Hawaii Labor Association, which essentially was a multi-ethnic labor. Its membership included not only Japanese and Filipino people, but also the Puerto Ricans, Spanish, Portuguese workers, all of those who were laboring within the agricultural sector in Hawaii. But these strikes weren't limited to the island, right? Because of exploitation, agricultural workers are one of the most exploited laborers to this day. And so a few years ago there was a strike of what is it? I want to say not Dole. It was the strawberry company. Anyway, it was they were telling everybody not to buy the strawberries because of the exploitation of its laborers, right? Of these fruit pickers and the lack of protection that they had, right? Um, and so this has been a history of exploitation against agricultural workers. So in 1880, you see Chinese fruit pickers in Santa Clara. This is our state, right? Japanese and Mexican farm workers, right? They joined together to create a multiracial labor association. Again, remember when I said labor unions are interethnic organizations, right? Because it's not, exploitation doesn't have a race. It doesn't, I mean, the people who are exploiting folks are targeting certain groups, right? But most often, if you are a laborer, you're being exploited, period, right? And so, in order to get a better standard of living, to resist this exploitation, to fight against it, you see marginalized groups coming together to form these labor associations, right? And so um, this is just a brief history associations, right? 1933, 700 Filipino lettuce pickers, right? And I mean, this is not an exhaustive list. We didn't even look at the domestic sector or the clothing and fashion sector. And I also want to just point out that, when we talk about striking, it wasn't just, people of Asian descent against white employers, right? But it was people of Asian descent against people who looked just like them, of other Asian employers who were also and exploiting them and oppressing them because we live in a capitalist society. And so exploitation, in order to be a capitalist, there you have to exploit, period. And that's, I mean, you don't have to take my word for it. You could look up, in order to make money, to make profit. If capitalism is about people over profit, guess what? Exploitation is needed. So you're going to read a lot about different groups within the Asian American community who are actively resisting these oppressive systems, this oppressive labor, this exploitative labor. You'll learn about some change makers. You'll read some firsthand history, right? Some firsthand stories, um, and really see how people of Asian descent fit within the history and narrative of labor organizing and labor justice.